We would like to remind you that the taking of photographs and use of recording equipment are strictly prohibited in the concert hall. Please take this moment now to silence your cell phones. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Susan Engel, and I have the privilege of being the director of 92nd Street Y Talks. I want to welcome you as well as our live stream audience tuning in tonight from all over the globe. Tonight is a very important evening at 92nd Street Y, as it speaks to the very heart of what we strive for every day, namely Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. Our guest tonight comes to us from France to enlighten us in these uncertain times. You will hear more about him from our moderator shortly. Before we begin, on behalf of our partner, the Forum for Law, Culture, and Society and 92nd Street Y, I want to thank the Ashner Family Evergreen Foundation for their support in making tonight possible. We value your participation in our programs, so I invite you to write your questions on the cards our ushers will distribute and collect midway through our program. I'm now delighted to introduce our moderator. Thane Rosenbaum is a longtime friend of 92nd Street Y, moderating programs and appearing on our stage for more than 15 years. We all know him as a critically acclaimed author of both fiction and nonfiction, a widely read essayist, and a distinguished fellow at NYU School of Law, which is one of our producing partners here at 92nd Street Y. So without further ado, to frame our conversation and introduce our very special guest, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Thane Rosenbaum.
Good evening. Welcome to the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society at the 92nd Street Y. Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, ended on Sunday night. And with that, the world was once again thrown into darkness. Some, like Bernard-Henri Levy, say that we are at war. But such a strange war it is. The enemy wears no uniforms. There are no real battlefields. Your neighbor might bring you a bundt cake or a bomb. Civilians are targets largely because they live in Western civilization. Their crime is culture and modernity. The punishment is the replacement of culture with a death cult. Everything about this room, the Kaufman Auditorium at the 92nd Street Y, everything it represents, everything that has showcased over the years cannot exist in a caliphate. You may not have realized this before. There is no poetry series in a caliphate. There are no novels. There are no movies. There is no music. Not even classical music. There is no art. We see what has happened to museums in Syria and Iraq. It is a resurrection of another dark age. And people that create art are the worst infidels of all, especially the women, homosexuals, and Jews. A female, gay, or Jewish artist is an instant candidate for decapitation. Imagine being all three. Worse still, imagine a world without liberalism, pluralism, tolerance, or free thought. Speaking of free thought, many of you have college-age children, and sometimes they come back and report, guess what? I've declared myself to be a philosophy major. And you say, what are you going to do with a philosophy degree? Well, nowadays, the world can actually use a few more philosophers. And tonight, we will hear from one of the world's foremost moral thinkers. Bernard-Henri Levy has made a career of saying things that we must hear, especially during troubling times. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my friend, Bernard-Henri Levy.
What a crowd.
BHL, thank you for coming. Oh, by the way, some of you may or may not know, his friends call him BHL. And for the price of your ticket today, if you might have seen on the right-hand corner, you can take it out, it says, from now on, you can call him BHL too. If you happen to be in Paris, you stop into a cafe, Champs-Élysées, he's there, walk up and say, BHL, how's it hanging? Something like that. Look, it's a new feature at the 92nd Street Y. It's a competitive market out there. I mean, you know, you go to Lincoln Center, the New York Philharmonic, you can't show up the next day and say to Alan Gilbert, hey, Alan, how's it going? Here you can. BHL, you look always, oh, somebody's phone. Please start before we get it.
Not mine.
Yeah. During the joke section, you can do that, but we're going to get to some serious things. We're still on. BHL, I must say, seeing you on this stage in this light, and before we get serious, you are still an astonishingly good-looking man. I do know one trade secret, though. Even though he's French, he doesn't eat cheese. Just saying, something to think about. Speaking of French, the most important question to ask you tonight is, how are your people? What is the mood of the French people after the massacre on November 13th? How is their spirit? How are they responding to each other, to their government, to their neighbors? Tell us.
The mood is low, distressed, sometimes despaired. The idea that the enemy can strike at any time, at any place. A lot of my relatives and friends lost somebody. I myself was informed of this attack by one of my best friends, a young, great photographer who was hiding in the kitchen of one of the restaurants which was attacked. He was wounded, protecting his girlfriend, and he called me just at the beginning of the attack. Number two, my people is nevertheless high spirit, cold blood, resistance, trying to continue life as it was, understanding that one of the targets of these criminals is to kill the spirit of the city, the shining spirit of our shining city about our hill. They want to kill that, so that we have to revive and keep vibrant the spirit of Paris. Most of Parisians feel that. That's why, by the way, they finally defeated, few weeks after, the twin of ISIS, not of ISIS, the twin of the Islamists, who is a national front. One nourishes, feeds the other. And the people of Paris and of France defeated Mrs. Le Pen. So distressed, but high spirit. And number three, because for an old normalien like me, there is always 1, 2, 3, dialectic. Number three, probably a better understanding of what terrorism is and of what it is in other countries, other cities. New York, 14 years ago. Tel Aviv, 14 hours before, to be under attack constantly.
Well, this is true. I mean, the United States and France, I mean, I think it's important to start off by saying we are very much here to see you. And I don't want to speak entirely for our audience, but we're also standing in solidarity with our Parisian cousins. France, thank you. France, I didn't tell you this in advance. You responded well. France is our first ally. We are twins of the Enlightenment, siblings of democratic liberalism. Both cities are known for light, the City of Light, the bright lights of Broadway. We are true creatures, children of the Enlightenment, and it does appear as if we're fighting the forces of darkness. Did the French people respond differently this time from the one that happened with Charlie Hebdo 10 months earlier? I mean, this is like twice within a year. Did the second one, I mean, remember the Secretary of State Kerry made an unfortunate comment when he said that the first attack was somewhat legitimate. And then he backed away from it and he said, well, there's a rationale. Look, he's broke his leg, leave him alone. But he did say, and I think you wrote that it was an unfortunate comment because it made it sound like, of course, cartoonists are legitimate and Jews are legitimate, but the people in a club, in a restaurant, are illegitimate. Did this shake the French in different ways because the targets were different and because it gave them a sense that no place is perhaps safe?
Unfortunately, yes. I must say that not for everyone, far from it, certainly not in the high spheres of power in France. French president, French prime minister, the opposition also reacted bravely, fairly, in the best way possible. But there is a great number of people who reacted in the way of John Kerry in front of the personnel of the American embassy. Meaning what? Meaning that at the time of Charlie Hebdo and Hypercacher, there was a sort of, there is today the idea that, of course, the cartoonists did not deserve. Of course, the Jewish ladies and men who were just buying things for Shabbat are not responsible, but in a way. By opposition to that, there is the current idea floating in the air of Paris, in some circles, not everywhere, that the young of Bataclan, the people of the Stadium of France, who were shot indistinctly, are innocent victims, without any sort of legitimacy. And there is a creeping, underlying little stream which has to be opposed, which is opposed by a lot of people in France, which says that there are some explainable targets, but when you explain too much, yes, you are close to justify, and you have some unexplainable, therefore unjustifiable targets, which is today. There can be this way. And another way of saying the same thing, you have in Paris some voices who begin to raise, who begin to appear, which say, in order to avoid further attacks, in order to avoid to be the targets of the indistinct targets of terrorism, we should get out of the game. Stop fighting them. Stop thinking to resist to them, to appease ISIS. There is some voices, even in the intellectual circles. We even had a few prominent intellectuals who said at the end, who did buy the wording of the ISIS propaganda, who said, we shot you, we struck you because you are bombing us in Syria. And we had some intellectuals who said, maybe they're right. maybe we should stop striking them and they would stop shooting us. This way of thinking is first not honorable, disgusting, and number two, stupid, because it has nothing to do with what we do. It has to do, as always, with jihadism, with what we are. As you well said, like New York, twin cities, cities of open cities, cities of citizenship, cities of civility, cities of civilization, cities embodying the very spirit of cities. There are others, cities like this, but New York, Paris, London a few years ago, Madrid have in common that they embody the very spirit of cities. And if you see well, all the fascisms of the last 70 years had always designated as one of their main targets the spirit of cities. From Hitler or Goebbels to the Nazi of today who are the Islamists, going through Pol Pot, they had a few targets: the Jews, the women, and the cities. I even remember when I was in Sarajevo 20 years ago, there was a great guy called Bogdan Bogdanovic who said that in the core of fascism, there is a lot of things: anti-Semitism, the will of genocide, and the will of urbicide. Bogdan Bogdanovic invented the concept of urbicide, urbs, city in Latin, urbicide. And it is true. You in New York were victims 14 years ago, September 11, of the will of urbicide. We are victims of the will of urbicide. Tel Aviv, every day, is victim of creeping, rampant, how do you say that, ongoing desire of urbicide, the stabbing, which is at the end of the daily stabbings, are a form, a cousin of beheadings. Beheading without the big weapon. Beheading with the weapon you find. But it is the same thing. Those who stab in Tel Aviv have seen, definitely, the video of propaganda of ISIS, praising beheading, praising the spilling of blood of Jews, because they are Jews, and they have read how the propaganda of ISIS declares a total war to the spirit of cities. And Tel Aviv is, like New York and like Paris, embodiment of the spirit of cities. Citizenship, civilization, civilities, cities.
Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Everyone they pronounce it better than me, but they know it.
It was good.
But everyone knows it, just like we know.
I hope I have such a good accent in English as well in French.
Well, you want to do better.
I'm sorry for my accent, by the way.
Are you kidding?
I'm so sorry.
I was 30 seconds away from saying, but we've got so much to cover. I wanted to say that since this is being live streamed, and since there are probably some expats who are French who are here, I thought that maybe if you wanted to briefly speak to the French from the stage of the 92nd Street Y, briefly, in part that we get to hear you in French, what would you say?
People want to hear you in French.
They just did. And I was rejected. They said, fraternité? These principles, these important virtues of what it means to be French, the polity of French, how is it maintained in an atmosphere, and believe me, we've had this experience first. We went through this first with the Patriot Act and the National Surveillance Act. How do you maintain these principles, very powerful principles of civil liberties, at a time of war when one is trying to combat terrorism? Now, you wrote recently in a widely read essay, it appeared in a number of different places, including Haaretz and Huffington Post and the Toronto Globe and Mail. You wrote, France must do by banning those who preach hate, by placing under closer surveillance the thousands of persons already classified as potential jihadists, by persuading social networks in the United States not to allow calls for kamikaze killings to proliferate in the shadows of the First Amendment. Now, I can tell you, you are a writer and intellectual of the French left. This cannot be said by the American left. You have to be on the Republican primary stage to say anything like that. This would never be said. This is something that you said, and you are, to so many people, the darling of the French left. And yet, we have these fundamental principles of French democracy and liberty. And is it possible to do this, to take this stance, including you have thoughts about how to respond to ISIS right now, Daesh? Can it be done, and can you still remain a quintessentially French society?
My problem has never been to be the quintessence of whatever. My problem is not to be left or not left. It is to say the truth. The truth and the just, the fairness, is to say two things at the same time. And you have to be able to count till two. One, two. One is not to transform Europe into a fortress. One is not to take argument of these attacks to close our border. One is not to fall into the trap in which Mr. and Mrs. Donald, which is Mr. Trump and Mrs. Le Pen, have fallen. This is the requirement number one. And I said in the same piece that at the limit, I would not be against welcoming even more.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that.
Refugees, number one. Number two, we are at war or we are not at war. I listened to my president who said we are at war. If we are at war, the enemy is outside of our borders and as always inside. I quote in the article Churchill, who is not a fascist, as far as I know, who is the embodiment of with General de Gaulle, of the resistance to fascism. The first thing which Churchill did when he entered into the war was not to watch the suspect, was not to forbid the Facebook of that time, who was I don't know what, to put in jail a few hundred people whom he considered as a danger for the nation. So, time has changed. We are not going to put in jail 1,000 maybe huge suspects, but to have them under scrutiny, to watch them carefully, not to joke any longer with the lives of the Jews of Hypercacher, of the free journalists, and of the people who like music. Yes, we have to. That's why we have to hold the two ropes at the same time. Not to fall in the trap of Mr. and Mrs. Donald, and not to fall in the trap of angelism, which would be not to take care of these people who are suspect of jihadism. Today, in the situation in which we are, it is impossible to preach in a mosque Salafism. It is to preach Salafism in a French mosque or in a French place. It is like preaching Goebbels in 1942 in a city of France or England. It is the same. It is to endorse the worst propaganda of those who want to kill us.
So you're saying that one literally can't or simply isn't happening right now in France? Or you're saying it must be stopped if it is to be?
It is less and less. When it happens and when it is reported, open, known, it is stopped immediately. To preach jihadism is considered today in France, and I think this is fair, as out of law. Mm-hmm. It is not, and I know that in America you live under the law, and that is great. That is a great thing of America, of the First Amendment. Okay. I love that. I am an advocate of free speech. But sometimes you have some free speech who are free criminal words. You have some words who are like bombs. You have some opinions who are not just opinions, who are appeal to murder. How do you have to consider them?
I'm having a heart attack. You know, I'm going to take him to NYU with me tomorrow. You're not allowed to say anything like this at a law school. I mean, you just can't. You know,
I can't or I can?
You can't. You can't say this at a university setting. You simply can't. You can't say this. What you just said cannot be said.
If I was at your school, I would quote Mallarmé, the French poet Stéphane Mallarmé, who knew what terrorism was, by the way. He went on the tribunal at the bar to defend a man accused of real terrorism. He was called Félix Fénéon, a great critic. Yep. A man like you.
Yes.
Critic of books, great critic, great reader. He went and he said at the bar of the tribunal, he said to the judge, "Be careful, Mr. Judge. There is a form of terrorism which is much more serious than what my friend Fénéon was accused to do. Words are the real bombs. Wow. Words can be real bombs." And I believe that.
You know, there's a famous quote that was said by one of our Supreme Court justices, Robert Jackson, for the lawyers in the room, said that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. We don't hear that quote. It's one of my favorite quotes. I've quoted it several times in some of my books because it's coming from a Supreme Court justice to say, look, let's not be crazy, right? Let's not be crazy. Yes, there are constitutional freedoms and they should be embraced, but there are such situations, there are such times. Another area where you have been incredibly candid and frank in ways that we don't see very often is in what to call what we're facing. You've said it's time to call this a war. You've had little trouble linking Islam with Islamism. Jihadism with Islam. You have been very steadfast in saying that in this case, language matters. Naming it matters. In the United States, we're having a tremendous amount of trouble with the language of what we're dealing with. Certainly on university campuses, forget it. On intellectual magazines, forget it. The President of the United States is constantly reminding us what we can't and can't say and what will aid the enemy, what will be good. And I think people are genuinely confused. You don't seem to be confused, by the way. President Hollande also said, he uttered the words radical Islam. Tell us why language and naming things is important.
Two things are important. Naming things, language and memory. In this matter, language and memory. Language is important because it is the only way to draw the line, in this circumstance, inside Islam, between the democratic Islam and the radical Islam. If we are not able to use the right words, we will be unable to draw the line, to make the separation inside the world of Islam between those who embrace a peaceful, democratic Islam and those who use Islam in order to justify crime. So wording is capital. And the two mistakes would be, mistake number one, to say Islamism and radical Islamism and Islam is the same thing. Stupidity number one. Stupidity number two, radical Islamism and Islam, or jihadism and Islam, have nothing to do. It is stupidity number two. So it's
because they're both untrue.
Both are untrue. And the whole work of an intellectual, of anyone who has a public parole, should be to help the Muslims themselves, to encourage them to draw this line between one Islam and the other one. To use a phrase of an American who was not my friend, Samuel Huntington, the clash of civilization. The only clash I know, the only clash of civilization I know is the clash inside the big world of Islam between those who sincerely want, embrace, match with human rights, democracy, or aspiration to democracy, and those who are probably, certainly a minority, who use Islam in order to justify crime. Wording is capital. Number two, memory is capital. If we want to explain what is happening today, this phenomenon of jihadism, it did not appear today. It did not fall from the sky, even if they believe that it did not come from the sky. It came from the past. And you cannot explain the flame of jihadism today if you don't go back long time ago, probably to the 20s. In the 20th of the 20th century, end of the 20s, beginning of the 30s, there has been a big world phenomenon, which we all know, which is the phenomenon of the Nazism. Okay? It was a phenomenon, a revolution, which inflamed Europe, Japan, some little pieces of America. You had America first and so on, you had that.
Certainly Italy, of course.
Italy,
right.
And the Arabic world. You had a wing of Nazism in the Muslim world. It was the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood was founded at the end of the 20s as a part of this big fascist movement, which was which pretended to be, and in a way was, the mainstream of the time.
But did anyone
The big difference between Europe and, for example, Iraq, Syria, or Egypt, or Palestine, the big difference is that in Europe, after the defeat of the Nazism, there was a work, difficult, not completed completely, hard to do, but a work of mourning, of memory, and an attempt to eradicate from the national cultures this plague. In France, it took time. In Germany, it was done more quickly, and it was done in a rather proper way. One of the problems of the Arab world is that the work was not only not done, but was not even begun. Why? Because the narrative of this part of the world after the Second World War was that fascism was just a European phenomenon. That as the cloud of Chernobyl, which was supposed in France to have stopped at the border, there was the idea that the cloud of fascism had stopped at the border of the Islamic world, which was not true. Muslim Brotherhood, Ba'ath movements in Iraq and in Syria. But when you say that the thing did not exist, that the cloud arrived just at the border, you have nothing to withdraw. You have nothing to mourn. You have no work to do, so the work was not done.
And also rejected, right? You're saying it wasn't even properly rejected. It wasn't acknowledged, it wasn't a rejection.
Because it was not acknowledged, it was not rejected. And because it was not rejected, it is still remaining. And it remains where? It remains in Hamas. It remains in Muslim Brotherhood all over this part of the world.
Daesh.
And it remains in Al-Nusra, in Al-Qaeda, and in Daesh. The last pearl, which has been dropped by the oyster of the fascism of the 30s, is ISIS today.
Well, are we now...
So words plus memory.
So are we now, given what you said, and that was an excellent explanation, are we much more... You're saying this is exactly what we need to do, is to speak of this as Islamic fascism, to actually name it because it never was properly named before.
Exactly.
But we're being told not to speak of it in terms of Islam at all.
Okay, we have been told, but I did it myself. I wrote a book, which I think is not translated in America, in 1994, which was called Dangerous Purity, 21 years ago. And I tried to find the secret thread, the common ground between Nazism, communism, and radical Islamism. I tried to build the common concept which helps to think the three together. And in this book, I proposed the formula of Islamofascism. I proposed the word because it seemed to me appropriate, number one, to name the phenomenon, number two, to say where it was coming from, and number three, in order not to put all the whole Islam in this basket, which, thanks God, is not the reality. I still believe that a big part of Islamic world, probably a majority of it, has nothing to do with fascism. And you have in the Muslim world, as we had in Europe in the 30s, a resistance, strong one, to this Islamofascism. But in order to encourage this resistance, in order to give this resistance inside the Arab world against fascism some weapons, some arguments, some help, we have to name the enemy.
Here's another comment that we'll pick up another theme here. You said, what holds us back? And then he says, at one point you say, what is it about this war that the America of Barack Obama, at least for the moment, seems not to really want to win? Now, one thought is that I have, one of my favorite BHL books is Left in Dark Times. And it, among its many arguments, is to talk about the way the left abandoned the core themes of what it means to be part of the left. Liberalism, democracy, justice, the rule of law, in favor of a kind of thinking that is fundamentally anti-colonialism, anti-Americanism, anti-Israel. So the foundational themes of the left were abandoned for just hating capitalism, hating America, hating white privilege and imperialism. And I wonder how much of this is played out. I mean, I don't know whether there's a PC movement in Paris, but we struggle here on college campuses. And my little joke about NYU, it's not NYU, it's every campus in the United States. There's certain things that are just not said, incredibly unfashionable thing to say. What, frankly, BHL has said for the last 20 minutes. The whole thing. But I wonder whether there's a way to understand this in that narrative of the older left, you know, because, you know, you've been a member of the left, but they've been beating up on you for years. You know, you've been both the darling and the whipping boy of the same group. But it does seem as that part of this difficulty of framing the language comes from that as long as America is behind it, or Israel's behind it, it's just bad. And so it's just simply much more fashionable to say, we will even be the strangest of bedfellows, will support Sudan, you know, Darfur, because they're anti-American, even though they're genocidal maniacs, right? We'll support Hamas because they hate the Israelis, no matter what they do. If you hate capitalism, if you hate democracy, if you hate colonialism, if you hate white privilege, you're not our friend. And I wonder if you want to talk about this, because so much of this has been part of your career, fighting against this struggle between not just the clash of civilization, but the clash of ideas among intellectuals.
There is two different things in your question. First of all, Obama, and then Darfur, and so on. And your two questions, I would reply to them by referring to concrete example. When I said that about Obama, the war he does not want to win, the war against Daesh, seems to me to be the war, strangely enough, he doesn't want to win. What did I mean? Mm-hmm. I was just coming back from Iraq and Syria a few weeks ago. I'm happening to shoot these days, these weeks, this recent month, a documentary about the 1,000 kilometers of front line mm-hmm. between the Kurds and Daesh. Daesh is beheading James Foley and killing the people who listen music in Bataclan, but they are also fighting on one front line of 1,000 kilometers, the Kurds.
Who are fighting back.
Who are fighting back. And by the way, they are much stronger, and the ISIS is less brave when they face real battlers and soldiers as the Kurds than when they are in front of a man with the hands like this on the knees waiting for the knee.
Who's a journalist, by the way?
Journalist. They are very brave terrorists and they are very coward soldiers. So what struck me when I made, it took me 2 months with my crew, with my camera, these 1,000 kilometers, what struck me is that it was not an unwinnable war at all. Not only it was not unwinnable, but each time I was eyewitness of some clashes between the Kurds and ISIS, I saw and I filmed, and you will see soon, ISIS escaping and the Kurds advancing. So I could not prevent myself from thinking that there is not the real will to defeat ISIS. And to be more precise, there might be the will in the free world in general, but maybe in America more than anywhere else. There might be the idea that at the end of the day, a reserve of jihadists, a bin, une poubelle at jihadists, enclosed in their border might not be such a bad thing. There might be this calculation that it would be better to contain but not destroy this reserve of. That's what I meant when I said the war we don't really want to win.
Because it's winnable.
It's more than winnable. Again, if we give to the Kurds the proper weapons, the proper instructions, the strategical command, because they belong to a coalition, it will be done easily. You can compare ISIS to Nazism for the ideology, but certainly not for the strength. Nothing comparable between the Wehrmacht, which was a huge power, and the ISIS, who are, again, bad soldiers and coward. I filmed the Battle of Sinjar a few weeks ago. There was no battle, nearly no battle, because the ISIS ran away without battling. That is about Obama. Now, left, not left. For me, the most important, the core of the ideal of the left of my youth, which is still today, is internationalism. Mm-hmm. Internationalism means what? It means unity of mankind, brotherhood of all victims, that there is not good and bad victims. And so internationalism, what I kept from that, from the time when I was a Marxist-Leninist, is that there is no difference between victims if you are white or black, your skin, if you are Jew or Muslim, if you are from Europe or from Pakistan. And what strikes me, what despairs me, what puts me in anger is when I see some of the leftists of today who choose their victims. And who choose them in function of what? In function of a so-called supposed geopolitics. The same who go in the streets to scream their indignation, which I can understand, when there is 1,800 people of Gaza killed. I can understand that they mourn that. Myself, each child, Palestinian child, dead by collateral attack is a disaster. They never go in the street to protest against not the 1,800, but the 260,000 deaths of Syria. They never go in the street to protest against the million. I never saw them when I was in the street of Paris to protest against the 1 million deaths of Rwanda. No one of them was there.
6 million Congolese.
When the Darfur, 400,000 deaths, no one was there. This, for me, is a real scandal. This double standard, this idea of good and bad victims, this is a scandal of our time. I remember a few years ago, 10 years ago, there is a great journal in France, you all know it, which is Le Monde. And Le Monde was directed at this time by two great guys, Jean-Marie Colombani and Edoui Plenel. And they asked me to make some stories, some reportage. I said yes, on one condition, which both of them accepted immediately. Let's go. I will go to report on the wars of today, of which the public opinion, in particular the left, never speaks. Because these wars don't match with the big narrative according to which you have on one side the empire, which is America, on the other side the former colonies. And there was 6 wars, which was Angola, Burundi, which was threatened to become another Rwanda, Sri Lanka, Darfur, Nuba Mountains. Nobody spoke about Nuba Mountains. A slow extermination, but nobody cared because the Jews were not implied. Israel could not be they could seek as much as they could not criminalize Israel. And America was on the good side. Colin Powell at this time made a little express trip in Sudan to say this is not good. So he was on the side of the victims. Victims endorsed by Colin Powell are not victims for a lot of people in the world. Victims who could be endorsed by Israel or who could be friends with Israel are bad victims, false victims, criminal victims, suspect victims. And this makes me crazy. And I oppose to that, that's true, the real values of the internationalism to which I have been faithful all my life. I tell you another story. You remember Durban, which was a conference in South Africa,
the anti-racism.
It was an anti-racist conference with a lot of NGOs gathering to protest against racism, slavery, and discrimination. And the meeting ended with a crowd of leftist NGOs shouting against Israel with this famous motto, "One Jew, one bullet, one Jew, one bullet." This is what the end of Durban.
This is an anti-racism conference.
Anti-racism conference. The end of that was that Israel was guilty of all the disorder of the world, that Israel was the most criminal state in the world, and that every Jew deserved one bullet. The conference ended with that. For me, it raised 2 problems. Number one, it was the act of baptism, the climax, I would say, of the new anti-Semitism, which is based on the hatred of Israel. Only for that, it was a scandal, and there was a shame on all the participants of this conference. But there was another shame for me, and I wrote that immediately at this time, 10 years ago. I remember all the representatives of these poor people of Burundi, of Rwanda, of the untouchable in India, the last caste, of tribes, forgotten tribes of Mexico or of Nicaragua who wanted their rights to be recognized. They came, all these people, they came to Durban with such a hope, with the idea that for the first time, thanks to the United Nations, they will have a stage to express their demands and their rights, and they were not given the parole. They were not given the possibility to express themselves because they could not prove, they could not take their passport showing that their enemy was Israel and the US. So they were out of frame, they were out of debate, and they were out of parole, and they went away from Durban with a big sorrow in the heart and with tears in their eyes. And for me, this was the second scandal of Durban.
The other night, you and I had dinner organized by our friend Michael Landau. Michael, don't say I never gave you a shout out. We were sitting with our friend George Klein, same to you. And we sat with a number of UN ambassadors. This is how this guy rolls. You have dinner, a bunch of UN ambassadors show up. You know, we were having this conversation, you may recall, and we talked about, again, this connection between, you know, having a discussion, an open discussion about Islam and jihadism and terrorism. And these were very well-intentioned people. One of the people, one woman was actually Christian, although she was an ambassador for an Arab country. And there was this sense of, how dare you paint us so broadly? Any suggestion, you know, you're dealing with 1 billion, and we keep hearing 1.5 billion people, and you're now engaging in collective responsibility. And you have recently, and so to them there's no connection again between Islam and terrorism. But one of the things that you've said forthrightly that we don't hear much about either is, we're not hearing enough from the Islamic world the language that you frame, not in our name. Simply saying, this is not us, and we repudiate this. And I thought you would want to talk about this more, because what we have instead is much more defensiveness instead of an open, honest conversation. You know, I mean, other than Bill Maher, no one else is willing to say this. And look how upset Ben Affleck got.
It is half true. Number one, it is a necessity, because if it is true that there is a battle inside Islam, between Islam and Islam, it is the affair of the Muslims first. And there is a responsibility for the most brave of them, for the most enlightened of them, for the clerics to give arguments to those who might balance, who might hesitate, and in order to attract them in the camp of democracy, they have to say, not in our name. It's an emergency that the biggest number possible of clerics and academics say to some of the Muslims who are like a lot of people, hesitant, not so brave. At the end of the day, courage is not, and I understand that everybody is not courageous, but there is a responsibility for some to give to those who hesitate some arguments, some courage, and some boldness. The only way to say it is to say clearly, these conception of the Sharia, this conception of the Ummah, this idea of jihad is heretic, is not the Islam which should be embraced in the 21st century. If there is a growing number of clerics who say that, who do this work on the words again, only these 3 words, by the way, jihad, Ummah, and Sharia. Mm-hmm. If you had some clerics really explaining to the vast crowd of Muslims that jihad could be, is, must be, I don't know, I'm not Muslim, a spiritual, an intimate requirement, a spiritual path, and so on, it would be a great job. So this is a necessity. Does it happen? More and more. In England, You had this great movement, Not in Our Name, which was launched 2 years ago. In Paris, it begins. Prime Minister of France, Manuel Valls, launched an appeal in this sense, and he was heard. A few weeks ago, you had 400 big eminences of French Islam who said that, Not in Our Name. And you have it, Morocco, for example. I gave the example last night, not only of Not in Our Name, but some human rights reforms which have been engaged in Morocco in the name of Quran, of a certain reading of Quran. So the process begins. Not enough, not strong enough, but it begins, and it's absolutely crucial. We were, a few days ago, 2 days ago, we were with my friend Michael Landau, who is here tonight, and whom you saluted before.
2 shout-outs.
We were celebrating, participating to a celebration of Nostra Aetate, which is this great revolution inside Catholicism.
Part of Vatican II.
Part of Vatican II, who made the peace, who asked forgiveness for the anti-Semitism of 2 millenaries.
And to acknowledge that Jews are not forever responsible for the killing of the
That they are not responsible for killing Christ, that they are part of salvation, and they are not only the fathers of the Christians, but the brothers, which make the whole difference, because the father is doomed to die and to give place to the son. Brother, they are equal, and so on.
And can coexist. And the whole concept of interfaith dialogue is traceable to Vatican II. Right.
So Nostra Aetate is a great date in the modern history, because it really began and contributed a lot to uproot the Christian anti-Semitism by doing that, by transforming the relationship father-son, old alliance, new alliance, into a relationship between 2 brothers, equal, having an equal right to pretend to save the world, to save themselves, to repair tikkun olam, the world, and so on. Okay, but what I want to say is that if you see at Nostra Aetate, 2 things happened in Nostra Aetate. Number 1, a reconciliation with another faith, which is the Jewish faith. And number 2, a work of Catholicism on itself. Let's imagine a Nostra Aetate in Islam. Mm-hmm. It could mean the 2 things. Number 1, a reconciliation with the Jews, as the Christian did, because there is a legend, a narrative, which is partly a legend, that, again, anti-Semitism is only a Christian affair, right, and that the Islam was never anti-Semite, which is not true. There is a Muslim anti-Semitism since long. There is also a history of friendship. I quoted the other night, again, the Sultan of Morocco, Mohammed V.
Great story.
Great story, who refused the yellow star of the Jews of Morocco, and he was very brave, and he resisted, he revolted against the Vichy regime to say, the Jews are my citizens, they are under my protection, I refuse the yellow star.
At enormous personal risk.
Personal risk, his own life, his own liberty, etc. So there is a great story of friendship between Jews and Arabs, but also a great story of anti-Semitism. So let's dream of an Nostra Aetate in the Muslim world. It would mean, number 1, a beginning of reconciliation with the Jews, asking forgiveness as the Pope did when the Pope John Paul II came on the Kotel to put the lid. At the end of the day, why should the Arab leaders or the Arab spiritual figures who have part of the guiltiness of the expel of so many Jews from their Juden-free land would not do the same? But number 2, the Catholic Church made a real work on itself, on its own text, a rereading of the Evangel. It would be great, Nostra Aetate, on the a Muslim Nostra Aetate would mean that also, a work on the words, a reinterpretation of some frozen verses, to reopen some verses of the Quran which have been closed and shut and frozen in a meaning which might have matched with ancient times, but not with our age, Nostra Aetate.
Just like Christ killers went away essentially with Vatican II.
Exactly. So, beyond, not only not in our name, the real expectation, which is not my expectation, it is the expectation of so many Muslims in the world. I heard so many times friends in Sarajevo, friends in Kosovo, friends in Turkey, friends in Morocco, friends in Tunisia to say the same. A Nostra Aetate would consist, number one, in a reconciliation with the other faith, but number two, in a reconciliation with oneself by making a reorganization, reinterpretation of their own textuality in order to breathe themselves better. How can you breathe? How can you feel like a complete free man when you live under a text and a dogma which is supposed to have been given once and forever without any possible explanation, commentary, adaptation? The Jews have invented a great thing. This is the best, probably the best invention of the Judaism. Is not Einstein, is not Freud, is not Marx.
Or bagels, nothing.
Not
bagels either.
The best invention is Talmud. Talmud, since the beginning, means that there is no sacred word which should not be subject to a complexification, to an interrogation, to a multi-meaning process. Talmud means that a word can be saint, but that it can be open to a polysemia. It can be the stage of a real contradiction and a real dispute. One of the greatness of the Jewish people, one of the things I am most proud for my people, is that this idea that at the same time a word can be saint and that at the same time it can be the object of an infinite contradiction, opposition, quarrel, and dispute.
Let's, I'm going to take some questions. Before I take some questions from the audience, let's talk about Jews and France. The killings at the kosher market back in January did not happen in isolation. During the Gaza war, 200 Jews were trapped in a synagogue inside of Paris with an angry mob shouting, "Jews, Jews to the gas," or "Hamas, Hamas, Jews to the gas." We know that years ago, Ilan Halimi was tortured by a gang of barbarians. He's a Jewish young man who worked in a cell phone shop, who was kidnapped and tortured for 29 days. There was the Jewish day school in Toulouse, where the rabbi and the children were, I think, decapitated by an Islamist, or shot by an Islamist on a motorcycle. And after last year's kosher market killings, it was reported that 15,000 Jews would leave Paris and go to Israel, and that in the prior several years, 5,000 Jews each were leaving to Israel. That's an astonishing number, 5,000 is an incredible hemorrhaging. The Prime Minister of France immediately said, "France without Jews is not France." You're not planning on moving. But is this a serious worry? Is it possible that 70 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, that Europe would become Jewless, that the largest Jewish country in Europe, France, is no longer home for Jews? Is this possible? This seems to me one of the real stories of the year 2015 that we haven't really talked about. will Jews only live in Israel and the United States, or will they continue to thrive throughout Europe?
I will be very frank with you, very frank. It is true. All the examples you gave are true, and they are more than concerning. It is horrible. And I would even say that even in the 30s, I think there was not killings in the streets of Toulouse or of Paris, and not kidnapping of an Ilan Halimi in the 30s. That is true. And I would be the last one to minimize that. Do I think that because of this, France is no longer a home for the Jews? No, I don't think it. And I don't think it for the following reason. Of course, anti-Semitism is strong. It exists. And I am, by philosophy, by temperament, I believe that anti-Semitism will never disappear, even in America, by the way. Even in America. And we could speak of America, not New York, but the rest of America. I'm not so sure that America is immune of anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism will not disappear, and it is embedded in the French ideology. It was the title of an old book I published 30 years ago. That is clear. But anti-Semitism is weak today. It may seem strange to say that, but it is true. In the France of today, the anti-Semites are weak. Why are they weak? For three reasons. Number one, because they are stupid. No, seriously. When you compare the situation of today to the situation of the, let's take two examples, Dreyfus affair, peak of anti-Semitism, and 30s.
The Dreyfus affair, just
Dreyfus affair.
Okay, yeah.
Dreyfus affair, you had some great big spirits, big brains who were the leaders of anti-Semitism, like Maurice Barrès, one of the best French writers, was a terrible, Arabic, enraged anti-Semite. In the 30s, some of the best French writers, Paul Morand, Louis-Ferdinand Céline, who was a genius, one of the reinventors of the French literature, were big shouters of anti-Semitism. Today, who is Maurice Barrès? Who is the equivalent of Louis-Ferdinand Céline? Mr. Dieudonné? They are nothing.
You know who that is? That's the...
They don't know, I thank God.
Yeah.
I hope you don't know, because they are nobody. They are stupid, little activists, narrow-minded rednecks of France. They are nobody.
And it's important to point out also that what BHL said before about the limitations of the First Amendment, in France, he's banned. The French government has...
Number one, they are nobody. Number two, the great difference is that in the 30s and in beginning of the 20th, end of the 19th century, the anti-Semite parole words were open sky. And not only open sky, but they were, you had some anti-Semites in the very body of the Republic. You had some MPs who were anti-Semite. You had some minister who was anti-Semite. The fiercest French anti-Semite of the 30s was called Mr. Darquier de Pellepoix, horrible man. A few years after, he was commissioned by the Nazi to be the commissary for Jewish affairs in Paris. In 1936, the year of the Popular Front, the most leftist assembly France had ever, July 1936, there was the election of the president of the assembly, of the French Congress. There was two candidates, a good guy who was Édouard Herriot, and this terrible anti-Semite, Darquier de Pellepoix. He had 160 votes for him. This is today inconceivable. You cannot quote one MP, one minister, one opponent who has the slightest weakness for anti-Semitism. When Manuel Valls, Prime Minister of France, decides to ban the redneck Mr. Mbalambala, Dieudonné, nobody opposes him. Nobody says, how dare you? He has the consensus of all the political forces. So this is a second big difference, which makes me say that the anti-Semites are weak. In the 30s, at the Dreyfus affair, they were at the peak of the state. They had the coup d'etat, the putsch of the anti-Semite has been achieved before Nazi. They were already in the state. Today, they are out of the institution. Second difference. Third difference with the 30s and with the Dreyfus affair. The Jews are strong in France and in Europe in general. The Jews are strong. Not strong because of like Edouard Drummond and the old anti-Semite believe, because they have some bonds and invested in Jewish banks. No, they are strong of values. They are strong of this talent which I quoted to interpretate, to make the Talmud. They are strong of this art of commentary which has enriched so much the French culture. They are strong of their own pride, which is admitted, recognized, and praised by most of the French society. And what a difference with their grandfathers and grand-grandfathers. In the 30s, the Jews were weak. The Jews hardly dared to say they were Jews. When they said that they were Jews, they said, but don't worry. Jews means nearly nothing. Jews, first of all, is not Talmud, is just Torah. And Torah, don't worry, Torah is just a few laws which are very similar to the law of the French Revolution. There was a sort of a minimization of Judaism which was emptied, voided of all its content, to be able to enter in the wall and to enter in the big shadow of French ideology. Today, it is the opposite. So when you put the three things together, not one big voice, thanks God, voicing the anti-Semitism, the whole Republic saying, like Manuel Valls, like François Hollande, and like Nicolas Sarkozy, France without Jews would not be France. Great quote when you think about it. Great quote. Nobody would have said that in the 30s or in the Dreyfus affair. And when you add to this the strength, the moral, intellectual, spiritual strength of the Jews, and especially of the young Jews, it creates a situation where the least I can say is that the battle is possible, and that it would be a big strategical mistake to leave the battlefield.
Notice how animated he was. You should know, and yes, he deserves. I think you should know that in March, Random House will be publishing BHL's newest book, which is entitled The Genius of the Jews. And he may have given you a preview of that right here. Here's a question from the audience that I will supplement a little. In 2011, you literally spearheaded the United Nations movement and the movement in France to come to the aid of the Benghazi rebels in Libya in an effort to oust Gaddafi and bring about a new regime of democratic reforms, hopefully, and human rights. Of course, that was when America was leading from behind, the French were out in front, and Gaddafi was finished, and it was considered an amazing achievement. And this woman or this man from the audience says, did we do the right thing in Libya? And I suspect he or she wants to know, Libya is now filled with terrorism. And there's a cause of great cynicism. The United States goes, we get rid of Saddam Hussein, the world is supposed to be better off, and now there's ISIS in Iraq. Gaddafi is gone, there's terrorism all throughout, Yemen, wherever we go, and there's this tremendous failure of Arab Spring. There's a reason to despair. It seems as if you have a choice. You either have an authoritarian strong man who beats up on the Muslim Brotherhood, or you liberate the country from the strong man, authoritarian, and then you have variations of the Muslim Brotherhood. And it makes one wonder, were we better off before? The world was surely better off without Gaddafi, but are the Libyans better off now? Are the Syrians, not the Syrians, the Iraqis, Afghanis? Even in Tunisia, Arab Spring now looks like it's a failure.
Number one, I would reply three things again.
There's a pattern.
In Libya, what did the France, America, and Arab League did? We prevented Libya to become another Syria. This is what we have to keep in mind.
Which is a huge
because
achievement.
Libya is, of course, disorder. In Libya, you have two pockets of jihadism, and in Libya, you had probably 20 to 30,000 deaths, probably less than that. Syria, and this is the result of the intervention. The result of the non-intervention in Syria, of the two patterns, two paradigmas. Paradigm of intervention, two pockets of Daesh, few thousand deaths, and disorder. The model of non-intervention, Syria, the product is not a few thousand, but 260,000 deaths, not two pockets, two areas of jihadism, but half of the country becoming a jihadist state, which is not the case in Libya. In Libya, you have some cells, but not a state. Daesh, as far as I know, is in Iraq and in Syria.
Yeah.
And number three, not disorder, but absolute chaos. So we prevented Libya to become another Syria.
I mean, it could have been much, much worse.
Of course. Did we do enough? No. And this is my opinion. It is known in France. I think that we should not have considered our task finished after the toppling of Gaddafi. This is the first point. The second point is that at the scale of the big history, at the scale of the long run time, we gave the proof with the Westerners for the first time. It was the first time in the history of the Arab world that we did not show that we were naturally, automatically, fatally, by fatality, the allies of the tyranns, of the despots against the peoples. Since ages, the Arab average people, those who we want to say not in our name, those who we wish and hope to see declare the war against jihad, since centuries, they see the West taking the party of the dictators against them. For the first time in Libya, they saw the reverse. They saw that without any interest, without any calculation, just for devoir d'ingérence, duty of involvement, just because of human rights, some French planes went to defeat a dictator. And this, believe me, for a lot of young people in this disaster which is the world of today, for a lot of young people in the Muslim world, this is great news. And this is a good seed in the brain.
This is what you would have wanted to see with the take false elections in Iran, where the symbolic value of showing those people that are interested in democratic reforms that we are out here and we support you.
We are, and for me, it was key that some Westerners and some Jews, and me as a Jew, show to these young Libyans that They are responsible of their destiny. They will build democracy or not build democracy. It will take 1 century like in France, or maybe they will be quicker than the French. I don't know. But at least we did not ban them from democracy. We did not believe in a racist way that the world was divided into two, those who have the right to democracy and those who have no right to democracy. The very fact that we said that for the future is a good deed. Number 3, we are in a Jewish house in a way. When Agar and Ishmael are in the desert, when they are at the edge of dying, of thirst, the God of the Jews decide to save them. The angels say, but why do you do that? Ishmael is going to have some descendants who will be the enemy of the chosen people, of your segula, of your treasure people. And God says to the angels, shut up. I have to avoid the little bloodbath. Whatever the consequences, I cannot let this little baby dry under his sort of kikayon. Same about kikayon for the prophet Jonas. When Jonas is ordered by God to go to Nineveh, which is the worst city in the world, which is the Tripoli of the time. Nineveh is Tripoli of this time. Jonas does not understand. Jonas says, like the question, why should I go to Nineveh? Why are all my colleagues, prophets, Joel, Amos, Isaiah, Jeremy, ordered to go to speak to the 2 kingdoms of Israel, and me, I'm condemned to go to speak to this bastard of Nineveh, who are my enemies, whom it is written that they will turn again. And God obliged him. He goes to the fish, then he's swallowed on the beach, and he's obliged, compelled to go. And so it was the same in Benghazi. You cannot, because of the possible consequences, you, as a human being, as a Democrat, as a believer in the creeds which we share, Americans and French, and you as a Jew, you cannot accept the hundreds of thousands of Ishmael of Benghazi, the hundreds of thousands of Ninevites of Benghazi, to be transformed into a butchery, to be drowned in the rivers of blood which was promised to Gaddafi. If you are faithful to I speak for myself and with my heart now, and not geopolitical or philosophical calculation. If you are faithful to the values which I inherited by the first man in history of mankind who bore my name, you cannot accept the bloodbath in Benghazi because democracy will take time, and because there will be chaos, and because there will be a few infiltration of Daesh. You cannot admit Nineveh to be destroyed.
BHL, let me just say, I've done this for a long time, and you and I have been friends for a long time, and I'm so grateful that you were here. But you are such an incredibly decent, elegant, and courageous man, a true intellectual and moral treasure on the international scene, and the world is so much better with you in it. Thank you for joining us.